Okay, cool. So, yeah, you now heard a lot about like the effects of those net zero solutions, of those solutions which try to store carbon instead of really cutting emissions elsewhere. So I will talk about this, yeah, this part of where emissions should actually be cut and where those net zero solutions lead to actually stabilizing the current polluting industry. So now you see the other side of the coin. And since I didn't really know how much you're into the topic of aviation, I just want to start with some general myths and facts about flying, and then go into those green myths and try to decipher them for you. So the first one, important one, is we always hear from the industry that flying has only a very small climate impact. About 2% is what the industry announces and what is repeated by governments and policies. And actually, it's at least 5%, since it's not only about CO2, it's also about other impacts like contrails and NOx. Another myth is that, well, if I'm buying organic, if I take less showers, avoid food waste, or even eat vegan, then sure, it's no problem to fly once in a while. So here you'll see a comparison between different types of consumption and how much actually aviation makes up. So you'll see a long haul flight and a short haul flight, and it's so much. So how come that it makes such a difference in personal footprints, that flying is still only responsible for 5% of climate heating worldwide? I mean, flying is so normal, right? Everyone does it. That's the next myth. So no, you see here a graphic of England with a great difference between who flies and who doesn't fly. So the top 1% took 1/5 of all flights abroad, and about 50% don't fly in a year. But that's nothing compared actually to the global level. And total estimations say that only between 5 to 20% have sit in an airplane, and of those, only some fly a lot. So mostly a few frequent flyers are responsible for those 5% or 5 to 8% of climate heating. Another assumption is that flights are cheap, but actually flights are made cheap while others bear the costs. This has to do mostly with enormous subsidies, which airlines, airplane constructors, and airports are receiving. Direct subsidies plus tax exemptions. So here you see that kerosene is not taxed almost anywhere in the global north. So all the external costs for the environment, for people affected, evicted, harmed by airports, or the harm for future generations, isn't priced in. But it cannot be priced in, because how would you set a price on the life of people or biodiversity? And that's actually also something that's a lot part of those nature-based solutions, or of this this direction of green economy, bioeconomy that's being taken right now, that they're trying to price everything in and put a price on nature. It's not possible. But it's clear that instead of setting incentives for flights through cheap prices, incentives should be set to take other forms of transport. So for this, we don't need to price in nature. The aviation industry has been lobbying strongly to keep these privileges, saying that a reduction of aviation is not necessary, because they claim that net zero aviation will be possible in the future. They mostly promote this concept of carbon neutral growth of aviation. So neutrality is basically this net. It allows for producing emissions on the one side, while the other side is supposed to reduce emissions, and in the end you'll have this net zero or neutrality. So in 2016, after decades of postponing climate action for the aviation sector, the UN aviation body, ICAO, which is heavily influenced by the industry, came out with their plan called CORSIA. So it's the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. And the plan is to continue growing, but through changes in technology and fuel, and mostly in offsetting, through offsetting. Officially, these emissions would stay at the same levels as 2020, which is way too high anyways, or would have been too high if COVID-19 wouldn't have led to a crisis in aviation, which is why the baseline has been shifted now after strong industry pressure. So it's now actually not 2020 is the baseline, but before COVID-19. Anyways, it doesn't matter. CORSIA is really, well, will not do anything for tackling aviation emissions. So let's just have a look at the myths hiding behind this concept of net zero aviation. First at the technology side, and then at what's all around the news all the time, the green fuels. And then at offsetting. So one of those myths is that we can run planes on biofuels, saying that those don't produce emissions. And I'm sure Almut will in the next input tell a lot more about this, but just quickly to say that palm oil is the most feasible biofuel for aviation, and I think I don't need to say much more about its harm. On this graphic you can see that palm oil is grown where rainforests are situated, leading to deforestation, which is not climate neutral at all. But what about e-fuels? It's all in the news. So e-fuels are basically fuels made from electricity, synthetic fuels or hydrogen, and it's feasible to produce it, but not realistic in the quantities needed. So there are no facilities to produce it yet, and the demand would be immense. If all current flights were to be operated with e-fuels, they would need more than the existing renewable energy of the whole world, leaving nothing for other sectors. So yeah, so much for the alternative fuels. The other myth is we don't need to reduce emissions from aviation. We can just pay others to compensate those emissions. Maybe people in the global south who can reduce emissions cheaper than we can. And it's really cheap. There's just a new study that was released today by Transport and Environment saying that airlines would pay 0.2% of operating costs to offset their emissions. So it's nothing. It would cost nothing, and that's the reason why they chose offsetting as a mechanism that allows them to say, oh, we are actually carbon neutral, or we grow carbon neutral while not changing anything. So offsets are hydroelectric dams, energy efficient cookers, tree plantations, those RED projects which have already been mentioned. And the calculations don't work. So most offset projects have very low likelihood to reduce additional emissions. And here you see in the graphic, you see a study by Efuel Institute who calculated that only 2% have a high likelihood that emissions reductions at the UN offsets are real, measurable, and additional. Because of, you know, everything that has been mentioned already, like fires burning the tree plantations and hydroelectric dams, which would have been built anyways, but then are counted as offsets and stuff like that. Also, there are quite some projects that have led to evictions of indigenous communities, human rights violations, and ecological damage, which already has been mentioned too. So for us, for the stake-grounded network, this is really a neo-colonial climate policy that leaves it to others to repair for our catastrophic mode of living and production. Well, actually, this repairing doesn't really work either. So there's really no other way than reducing aviation, degrowth of aviation. The lie that net zero aviation is possible, or the wish that it might be possible in the future, which realistically is not in the next 2 decades or not at all. So this wish and those claims by the industry and all their advertising they're doing on this, it actually diverts attention from the necessity to reduce demand. It's a very strategic move by the industry to keep their unsustainable business models alive. We are working very hard on using this moment of COVID-19 crisis to push for a just transition of aviation, but the industry is also working very hard on spreading myths in order to uphold their privileges. So I hope you all help us in myth busting in order to push back the industry growth. Okay, thank you.